I live in a peaceful European country, the kind of place where crime is so uncommon that most people don't feel the need to worry about their safety. Even in my small town, surrounded by dense woods, it's normal for people to walk around alone at night without a second thought. Personally, though, I've always found the woods a bit unsettling after dark. I usually avoid going out alone at night unless I'm with friends. When I do, night walks can be quite enjoyable, or at least they used to be. Last week, my best friend and I decided to take one of our regular nighttime walks. It's a familiar route, one we've followed countless times without any issues. The path starts out easy enough, with streetlights illuminating the way and a few scattered houses nearby. However, the final stretch gets darker. Past a small tunnel, the paved road transitions into a rocky trail flanked by woods on one side and open fields on the other. That night started off just like any other. We walked, chatted, and laughed, not thinking about anything remotely frightening. But as we approached the tunnel, something unusual caught our eye, a white van parked near a ditch off the road. Its engine wasn't running, and there was no one in sight, at least not that we could see. We joked about it, saying it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I even mentioned spotting a silhouette inside. My friend rolled her eyes. "Don't start," she said, clearly unimpressed. We laughed it off and kept walking. Once through the tunnel, the trail slopes upward before leveling out. At the top of the hill, the woods run along one side while an open hops field stretches out on the other. It's dark but usually serene, and we've always felt safe there. About 5 minutes into this stretch, we noticed headlights behind us. Initially, we thought nothing of it. Farm vehicles often travel this road, given the nearby farms. We moved aside to let it pass, still deep in conversation. But then we noticed something odd. It was the same white van we'd seen earlier. A sense of unease began to creep in. We tried to convince ourselves it was a coincidence and hoped the van would drive past us. Instead, it slowed down and stayed right behind us, matching our pace. If we sped up, it sped up. If we slowed down, so did it. The sound of the engine idling close by made my stomach knot. I bumped my friend lightly on the shoulder, locking eyes with her. "Run," I whispered urgently. "Into the field. Now." Without hesitation, we bolted, veering off the path into the hops field. The uneven ground was tricky to navigate, and we stumbled a few times over the mounds of soil. Finally, we found a large mound and crouched behind it, trying to quiet our ragged breaths. The van came to a stop on the road, its engine still running. Then the headlights flared as the high beams turned on, flooding the field with harsh light. Moments later, 2 men climbed out. They wore dark hoodies and carried flashlights, which they used to sweep the field, their beams slicing through the rows of hops. We froze, barely daring to breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was convinced they'd hear it. One of the flashlight beams passed dangerously close to our hiding spot. I squeezed my friend's arm, silently begging her to stay still. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a minute or 2 before the men gave up. They climbed back into the van, turned it around, and drove off in the direction they'd come. We stayed hidden for a while longer, just to be sure. Then we got up and ran as fast as we could through the field toward the distant houses. When we finally reached the glow of porch lights and saw the outlines of homes, we both let out shaky sighs of relief. Back in town, the fear began to ease, though it didn't truly leave until we were safely home. To this day, we have no idea who those men were or what they wanted. It could have been nothing, but it didn't feel that way. The way they followed us, stopped, and searched, it all seemed intentional. The memory still gives me chills. Needless to say, we haven't taken that path again. Maybe we're being overly cautious, but from now on, I'll stick to well-lit streets and busy places. A few years ago, I was driving through a vast desert on my way to visit a friend in Arizona. The highway stretched endlessly, with nothing but sand, scrub, and jagged rock formations breaking up the monotony. At first, I thought the isolation would be a good way to clear my head, but as the sun dipped lower, the solitude began to feel less soothing and more unsettling. There was no cell service, no other cars, and the radio had stopped picking up stations hours ago. The only sound was the steady hum of my car's engine. About 20 miles from the next town, according to the last road sign, I decided I'd stop there for the night. That's when my car started having trouble. It was gradual at first, the engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights flickered. I managed to pull over just as the engine died completely. I sat there for a moment, hoping it was a minor issue and that the car would restart. But when I turned the key, all I got was a faint clicking sound. Great. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and popped the hood, though I didn't know much about cars. Nothing looked out of place, no smoke, no leaks, but still, the engine refused to start. I glanced around, hoping for the unlikely sight of another vehicle or a distant building, but the highway was deserted, and the landscape stretched into an endless void. The sky turned a deep orange as the last of the sunlight disappeared, leaving me with the unsettling realization that I'd soon be surrounded by complete darkness. I decided to wait. Someone was bound to come by eventually, it was a highway, after all. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and tried to stay calm. An hour passed, maybe longer. The sky was pitch black, and the stars, while brilliant, did little to ease my nerves. The highway remained empty, the silence almost deafening. Then I noticed movement. On a ridge about 50 yards away, a figure was standing perfectly still, silhouetted against the starry sky. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a coyote, but as I squinted, I realized it was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself they were just a hiker or camper, someone who happened to be in the area. But the longer they stood there, unmoving, the less sense it made. Why hadn't I noticed them earlier? I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it toward the ridge, hoping to scare them off, or at least get a better look. The beam barely reached that far, but it was enough to catch a slight movement. The figure tilted its head, as if curious, and then stepped out of the light's reach, vanishing behind the ridge. My heart was pounding as I locked the doors again, gripping the flashlight tightly. It's just a camper, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. The way they moved, silent and deliberate, felt off. I sat in the car, fiddling with the broken radio to distract myself, but the static only made the silence more oppressive. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. The sound came from behind the car. My stomach dropped. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving toward the driver's side. I froze, gripping the flashlight like it was a lifeline. The sound stopped just outside my window. I didn't dare look. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps resumed, retreating this time. Summoning every ounce of courage, I glanced out the window. There was no one there. The ridge was empty, and the desert seemed still again. Just as I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, a loud thud hit the back of the car. I jumped, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. Trembling, I snatched it up and aimed the beam toward the ridge, just in time to see the figure climbing back up, disappearing over the top. That was it. I wasn't staying to find out what they wanted. Grabbing my backpack, which held a few essentials, I left the car and started walking toward the town I'd seen on the road sign. I stayed on the highway, my flashlight pointed ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder and think I saw movement, a shadow flitting across the road or a shape shifting in the darkness. But when I stopped to look, there was nothing there. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as a truck slowed to a stop beside me. The driver, an older man with a kind face, rolled down the window and asked if I needed help. I told him everything, the breakdown, the figure on the ridge. He listened, nodded, and said, "People talk about strange things out here. Best not to stay long enough to see what they are." He gave me a ride to the next town, where I was able to call for a tow. The next morning, when we went back for the car, it was untouched. As I climbed into the tow truck, I glanced back at the ridge one last time. I could have sworn I saw the figure again, just standing there, watching. A few years back, I agreed to help my cousin Ryan move some of his old belongings from a family cabin located deep in the Vermont woods. It was a secluded property our grandparents had owned for decades, but no one had lived there in years. The place was so remote that it didn't even show up on Google Maps. Ryan had given me handwritten directions to find it. The plan was straightforward: drive up there, clear out some furniture and boxes, and haul everything back to his place. Easy, or so I thought. At the last minute, Ryan called to say he was sick and couldn't come, but he urged me to go ahead without him. He reassured me the cabin was unlocked and there wasn't much to move. I wasn't thrilled, but I figured I'd get it over with. Early Saturday morning, I packed some snacks, loaded up my truck, and set off. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, and eventually nothing but faint tire tracks cutting through the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains. The cabin was in worse shape than I'd imagined. The roof sagged, the windows were filthy, and the porch looked like it might collapse under my weight. The clearing around it was overgrown, and the silence was unsettling. There wasn't a single sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I parked my truck and went inside. The air was thick with mildew and the musty smell of old wood. Dusty sheets covered the furniture, and a small pile of boxes was stacked in one corner. It was obvious no one had been here in ages. For the next couple of hours, I worked on loading the truck, making trip after trip from the cabin to the driveway. By the time I was done, the sky was a fiery orange, and I was exhausted. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since morning. I decided to sit on the porch, have a quick snack, and soak in the quiet before heading out. As I sat there, the woods around me grew darker and eerily quiet. The wind had stopped, and the stillness pressed in like a heavy weight. Then I heard it, a faint, constant hum. At first, I thought it was a distant plane, but it didn't change or fade. It lingered at the edge of my hearing, unsettling and strange. I tried to brush it off, but something about the sound put me on edge. I scanned the clearing, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. Nothing moved, just shadows creeping closer as night fell. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement at the tree line. I thought it might be a deer, but the shape wasn't right. It was tall, thin, and upright, clearly a person. My chest tightened as the figure stepped into the clearing. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore dark clothes, and his face was hidden in the shadows. He stood motionless, watching me from across the clearing. "Hello." I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. He didn't move an inch. A cold shiver ran down my spine. There was something unnatural about the way he stood, perfectly still, as if frozen in place. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My truck was only a few steps away, but the thought of turning my back on him made my stomach churn. "Can I help you?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked back into the woods. His movements were unnervingly smooth, almost too fluid, and he vanished into the darkness without making a sound. I didn't wait to see if he'd return. I grabbed my things, jumped into the truck, and sped off, the tires kicking up dirt as I fled. My heart pounded the entire way down the winding trail. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see him chasing after me, but the road remained empty, and the woods stayed silent. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking as I called Ryan to tell him what had happened. He laughed it off, saying it was probably a hunter or some local messing around. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just someone passing through. "3 years ago, I was driving through rural Iowa on what was supposed to be a quick scenic detour after visiting a friend in Minnesota. I've always enjoyed road trips, especially the peaceful backroads where you can roll down the windows, crank up some music, and enjoy the solitude. But this trip, this one left a lasting mark on me, and not in a good way. It was late afternoon when I veered off the main highway onto a quiet county road. The scenery was quintessential Midwest, endless rows of cornfields stretching out on either side of the narrow, two-lane road. Occasionally, I'd pass a dilapidated barn or a lone mailbox at the end of a dusty driveway, but I didn't see another car for miles. At first, the isolation was calming. It was just me, the open road, and the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. As the sun began to set, though, that peaceful feeling started to fade. The road seemed to go on forever, straight into the horizon, and the shadows from the cornfields grew long and menacing. It hit me then, I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere. About an hour after sunset, my low fuel light blinked on. I cursed myself for not stopping at the last gas station but reassured myself that another one had to be nearby. Even rural areas have gas stations, right? I kept driving, scanning the roadside for any sign of life, but there was nothing, just more fields of corn. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the stalks, but when I glanced again, I saw movement. Something, or someone, was moving between the rows of corn, keeping pace with my car. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the faint outline of a figure, hidden just beyond the edge of the field. My stomach clenched, and I instinctively pressed down on the gas pedal. The figure matched my speed. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I'd been driving too long and needed to rest. But every time I looked back, it was still there, occasionally disappearing into the corn, only to reappear a little closer to the road. The road was too narrow and winding for me to speed up much, but the thought of stopping even for a second made my skin crawl. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, refusing to look at the cornfield again. After another 10 minutes of tense driving, I spotted a faint light in the distance. Relief washed over me, it looked like a gas station. As I got closer, I saw it was an old, run-down place with a single pump and a flickering neon sign that simply read, "Gas." The building was dark, except for a dim light above the door. I pulled up to the pump, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling twisting in my gut. Glancing back at the cornfield, I saw nothing. The figure was gone. Maybe I had imagined it after all. The rows of corn stood still, swaying gently in the night breeze. I stepped out of the car, grabbed the pump, and started filling up. The silence was overwhelming, no cars, no voices, not even the buzz of insects. Just the faint gurgle of gas flowing into my tank. My eyes kept darting to the cornfield, half expecting something, or someone, to step out at any moment. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow. Deliberate. I spun around, but there was no one there. The road was empty, and the gas station parking lot was silent. My gaze snapped to the cornfield, expecting to see that figure again, but all I saw were the endless rows of tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze. My pulse thundered in my ears. I finished pumping gas as quickly as I could and hurried inside to pay. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled softly overhead. The interior was just as rundown as the outside, dusty shelves with outdated snacks, a faded calendar on the wall, and an empty counter with no attendant in sight. "Hello." I called out, my voice shaky. No response. After waiting a moment, I left a $20 on the counter and bolted back to my car. I didn't want to stay there a second longer. As I started the engine and my headlights illuminated the road ahead, I froze. A man was standing at the edge of the cornfield, directly in front of my car. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that looked unnervingly clean for someone out here. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but I could tell he was staring straight at me. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my heart racing. He didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I don't know what came over me, but I slammed the car into reverse, backing away as fast as I could without losing control. The man didn't follow. He just stood there, watching as I turned the car around and sped off into the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached a larger highway with streetlights and other cars. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road or emerging from the cornfields. But he was gone, or maybe he was still there, hidden in the shadows of the stalks. To this day, I have no idea who, or what, he was. Maybe it was just some guy messing around, but it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like he was waiting for something. Whatever it was, I've avoided back roads ever since, especially at night. And if I ever see movement in a cornfield again, I won't stick around to find out what it is.